1,000 years of national myth. A language that does not belong to any neighbor. A founding cavalry charge in 895. And a population whose genes, quietly, say something else. Nearly 11 centuries of silence. No confirmed line of descent from the Khanty hunters of the western Siberian taiga. No verified migration trail tracked from grave to grave across the Pontic steppe. Just a name carried on the breath of a single language. And a story told and retold beneath the equestrian statues of Heroes' Square in Budapest. The story is famous. In the autumn of 895 of the Common Era, 7 Magyar tribes crossed the Vereki Pass under a chieftain remembered as Arpad, descended into the Carpathian Basin, and bound the land we now call Hungary into a single political fate. The conquest, Honfoglalas, the taking of the homeland, was completed by about 907. Just over a century later, in the year 1000, Stephen Thurfton was crowned a Christian king, and a steppe confederacy became a European kingdom. That is the founding narrative. It is taught in schoolrooms, it is sung in anthems, it anchors a national self-image, in horseback ancestry, in distance, in the long ride from somewhere east of the Urals, to the basin between the Carpathians and the Danube. And then, beginning quietly in the early 2000s and accelerating after 2008, a different kind of evidence began to surface from the soil, and from the polymerase chain reaction tubes of a laboratory in Szeged. Yes, the story did not collapse. It did not get destroyed, or debunked, or shattered. Those are not the right verbs for what genetics has done here. The story got complicated. It got layered. It got rewritten in a softer hand than the original myth. And historians, working alongside geneticists, are quietly redrawing the map of what it means to be Hungarian at the level of bone, blood, and chromosome. To follow what changed, you need a brief grammar of the molecule. Every human cell carries 2 clocks. One is mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, tracing the maternal line back through generations like a single inherited candle. The other is the Y chromosome, passed only from father to son, marking the paternal line. Both accumulate small, datable mutations. Group the mutations and you get haplogroups, branches of a family tree drawn across continents. Some haplogroups are deeply European. R1b, particularly the U106 subclade, runs through Germanic and Western populations. I2a, especially the Dinaric variant, is the South Slavic and Balkan substrate, ancient in this part of Europe. I1 anchors Scandinavia and the north. Other haplogroups speak of the east. N1c is associated with Uralic-speaking peoples, the Finns, the Estonians, and, more deeply, the Khanty and Mansi of western Siberia, who speak languages most closely related to Hungarian. R1a Zeu Ontoru is the Asian steppe lineage, the marker of Bronze Age and Iron Age horse cultures stretching from the Volga to the Altai. QM242 sits deeper still in Inner Asia, the same broad lineage carried by some Native American founder populations. C2 is the East Asian paternal line of the Mongol world and the Eastern steppe. If the founding myth were the whole story, if modern Hungarians were, in genetic terms, the unbroken descendants of a steppe nomad confederation that rode in from the east and settled the basin, then those eastern haplogroups should sit in the population at meaningful frequency. They should be the ground note of Hungarian Y chromosomes. They are not. In modern Hungary, the dominant paternal lineages are R1b, I2a, I1, and a substantial component of R1a, but mostly the European R1a, not the Asian Z93 branch. Together, the recognizably Asiatic markers, N1c at low frequencies, Q, and C2 at single-digit percentages, the eastern subclades of R1a, account for somewhere in the range of 5 to 10% of modern Hungarian men, depending on the region sampled and the cutoff used. In other words, by paternal lineage, the average Hungarian today looks far more like a Slovak, a Croat, an Austrian or a Romanian than like a Khanty hunter on the Ob River. The language is Uralic. The genes are, in the broad sense, Central European. That is the anomaly, the signal that arrived, quietly, beneath the national story. The first systematic crack opened in 2008. A research team at the University of Szeged, led by the geneticist Tibor Török, published Y chromosome work comparing modern Hungarians with samples drawn from Hungarian-speaking populations and with reference panels across Europe and Asia. The pattern was clear enough that it survived every later replication. Modern Hungarians, on the male side, cluster with their Central European neighbours. The deep Uralic paternal signature, visible in the Conti and Mansi, the people whose languages share an ancestor with Hungarian, is faint at best in the modern Carpathian Basin. Then came the cemeteries. Between roughly 895 and the early 1000s, the conquering elite buried their dead in distinctive graves. Sabres, horse harnesses, composite bows, stirrups of a steppe pattern, belt fittings of an inner Asian style. Archaeologists call these the Honfoglalo, conqueror burials, and they are scattered across the basin, in clusters that mark the early Hungarian aristocracy and their retainers. Beside these are other graves from the same century, simpler, without the horse gear, without the saber. Commoner graves, locals. The agricultural substrate that lived in the basin before the conquest and continued to live there afterward. Endre Neparatsky, working with Tibor Turok and an expanding team at the University of Szeged Department of Genetics, set out to sequence both. Conqueror graves on one side, commoner graves on the other, modern Hungarians on a third. Reference panels from Siberia, the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and Europe on a fourth. The results, accumulating across multiple papers through the 2010s and consolidated. In a scientific reports paper from Neparatsky and colleagues in 2020, drew a picture sharp enough to redraw textbooks. The conqueror burials carried a strikingly different paternal profile from the commoners. N1C showed up in elite graves at a frequency it does not reach in modern Hungarians. R1A Z93, the Asian steppe branch, appeared. QM242 appeared. C2, the East Asian, Inner Asian marker, appeared in conqueror graves with horse gear, exactly where the archaeological logic would predict it. The elite, in genetic terms, looked like what the chronicles said they were. A coalition with deep Eastern roots, recently arrived, riding in on a steppe lifestyle. The commoner graves told a different story. Their paternal lineages, R1b, I2a, I1, European R1a, already looked like the genetic neighbors. They already looked, broadly, like the modern population. The substrate was European. It had been European before the conquest, and it remained European after. The Reich Laboratory at Harvard Medical School, working with European partners on basin-wide ancient DNA datasets through the late 2010s, and Anna Szeksenyi-Nagy's group at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences Research Center for the Humanities, working on the genetics of the Carpathian Basin across the Avar, Roman, and earlier periods, added the deeper layers. The basin had been crossed and recrossed for millennia. Roman provincials, Pannonian Celts, Sarmatians, Gepids, Lombards, Avars, themselves a steppe confederacy that had ruled this same land from the late 6th century until Charlemagne broke their power around 800. And beneath all of them, Neolithic farmers and earlier hunter-gatherers, layered like sediments in a river bend. Step back, and 3 pillars of evidence converge. First pillar, the modern population. Whole genome and Y chromosome studies place modern Hungarians within the Central European genetic continuum. The dominant ancestry is European, with only a small Asiatic admixture that sits at the edge of detection in many individuals and concentrates more visibly in certain regional pockets. Second pillar, the conqueror cemeteries. The Honfoglalo era elite graves carry exactly the Asiatic and steppe Y DNA signal you would expect from a horseborne confederation arriving from the east. The signal is real. The migration is real. The conquerors were not invented by chroniclers. Third pillar, the contemporary commoner graves and the deeper basin record. The general medieval population of the basin already looked European before the conquest, looked European during the conquest, and continued to look European after the conquest. The elite arrived and ruled, but they did not numerically replace the people they ruled. A fourth pillar, almost forgotten in the genetics, comes from comparative linguistics. The closest living relatives of the Hungarian language are Khanty and Mansi, the Obogric languages spoken by a few thousand people in western Siberia today. If Hungarians were, demographically, the descendants of an Obogric population that simply moved west, modern Hungarians and modern Khanty should share an elevated paternal signature. They do not. The languages share an ancestor. The men, mostly, do not. So how did a Uralic language come to be spoken in the middle of Europe by a population that, in genetic terms, looks Central European? The mechanism is well known to historical sociolinguistics. It is called elite dominance language shift. A relatively small, mobile, militarily organized population takes political control of a much larger sedentary population. Over generations, the language of the conquerors becomes the language of the court, then the church, then the market, then the household. The original population does not move and does not in any large fraction get replaced. They change what they speak. The classic European parallel is Norman French in England after 1066, except that in England, the local Germanic vernacular eventually absorbed Norman French rather than being replaced by it. In the Hungarian case, the direction ran the other way. The conquering Magyars were fewer in number than the Pannonian, Slavic, Avar-descended, and post-Roman populations they encountered, but they held the political center for long enough, and inserted themselves into family and clan structures deeply enough, that the basin became Hungarian-speaking. Imagine the threshold moment. A Slavic farmer in the Pannonian lowlands, late in the 9th century, looks up from a field of millet and sees riders on the rim of the world. A cavalry profile silhouetted against a late summer sky, lacquered boughs across the saddle, a sound of harness and hoof carrying down the valley before the riders themselves appear. He does not flee. His grandchildren do not flee. They learn a new language, pay new dues, take new names, and bury their dead under a new cross. Their bones, 4 centuries later, still carry the Y chromosome of his line. Only the words on their lips have changed. That is the mechanism. That is how a language travels without the people traveling. The preservation side of the story matters too. Why can we read this so clearly from the graves? The Carpathian Basin sits on a band of loess and alluvial soils, fine, mineral-rich, well-drained sediments laid down by the Danube and the Tisa across glacial and post-glacial millennia. These soils preserve bone better than acidic forest podzols or waterlogged peat. Combined with the relatively dry continental climate of the Hungarian plain and burial practices that place the dead in stone-lined or wood-lined pits with grave goods, the conditions favor the long survival of DNA inside the petrous bone, of the inner ear, the densest piece of the skull, the part that ancient DNA labs now drill for endogenous human sequence. Szeged's lab work, like Reich's at Harvard and the Hungarian Academy teams in Budapest, depends on that small pyramidal bone holding its genetic record across 1,000 winters. Pause for a careful word. The genetic data does not unmake the Hungarian nation. It does not turn anyone into a stranger in their own country. The conqueror burials are a relatively small sample, hundreds of individuals across a century-long horizon, not tens of thousands. And the inferences scale accordingly. European is not a single ancestry, but a mosaic of Slavic, Germanic, Celtic, Roman, Avar, and older substrates that themselves moved and mixed for millennia. Many modern Hungarians do carry traceable Asiatic signal at low frequencies, especially in eastern regions and in certain noble lineages, and that signal is a real, defensible piece of the founding story. What the data does is layer the story. The founding narrative is not false, it is partial. There was a conquest, there was an Arpadian elite. They did bring a language and a political identity from the east, they did rule. Their genetic signature is visible in the right graves with the right markers, at the right time. What the founding narrative leaves out is everyone else. The Slavic-speaking farmers who were already in the basin when the riders arrived. The descendants of the Avars, who had ruled the same land for 2 centuries and never went anywhere when their khaganate collapsed. The Roman Pannonian remnants, the Gepid stragglers, the whole sedimentary inheritance of a basin that had been a crossroads of Europe for as long as Europe had existed. Not Magyars only, Magyars layered over Pannonians, layered over Avars, layered over Romans, layered over the older farmers who first cleared the Loess. Not a transplanted nation, a renamed one. Not a steppe people, who arrived intact and remained intact. A steppe elite that married into the basin and gave their tongue to the people who absorbed them. It is, in the end, a story like many European stories. The English are not, in their genes, the Anglo-Saxons of the Chronicles, nor purely the Britons who came before, nor the Normans who came after. They are a layered alluvium of all of them. The French are not in their genes the Franks who gave them a name. The Bulgarians are not in their genes the Turkic Bulgar elite that gave them theirs. Names travel light. Languages travel light. People are heavier, slower, more rooted to the land they till. Hungary, seen in this longer light, is not a nation built on a fake origin. It is a nation built on a true conquest and an older flaw, and the official origin story is more layered than tradition holds. Stand for a moment on a ridge above the Tisa in the early hour before sunrise. The basin is mist. The river is a slow seam of silver where the light catches it. There is no horseman on the ridge anymore. There has not been one for centuries. But the silhouette is easy to imagine. Composite bow, lacquered quiver, a single rider against the pale of the eastern sky. Beneath your feet, in the Loess, the bone keeps its record. The conqueror in his saber grave. The farmer in his unmarked pit. The Avar princess in her gold-threaded shroud. The Roman veteran with a stamped tile beside his skull. The Neolithic mother with a child curled at her hip. All of them, in their different chromosomes, in their different lineages, are part of what later generations would call Hungarian. The horseman did arrive. The language did travel. The name was real. The story was real. It was only ever, like every national story, a single layer in a much older basin. A basin that kept its dead. The way a river keeps its silt, patiently, in long horizontal bands, waiting for someone with a drill and a sequencer to read them. The horseman crosses the ridge. The mist closes behind him. The river keeps moving. And somewhere in a quiet laboratory in Szeged, under a single lamp, a centrifuge turns through the pre-dawn, winding the past, very slowly, back into the present.